That whole concept of how much data can you get? There's no limit to the amount of data. The critical part for me is then how do you turn that around? Where do you find consistency across the silos in the kind of data they want to look at? My ops philosophy comes from my background. I was a CFO for 15 years. Then I moved into a chief operating officer role with account planning and really focused on account remediation. And then I moved into a sales operations role. And through all of those experiences, process, attention to detail, those are the things that I brought to each of those. An understanding of the big picture in terms of the data, the master data, how it impacts each organization. Right? We have all our silos, but how do you bring those things together? My life overall is pretty laid back in terms of how I approach things. I'm a little deliberate on making big decisions. But I'm also very quick at making the small decisions. So I believe in that 80-20 rule, right? So 80% of your decisions, you should be able to make really quickly and move on, and you deal with the risk of that, but it's low risk. And then the other 20% are the big rocks where you have to really think through. So I spend a little more time thinking through those big decisions and how I pull things together, and picking a methodology or picking the right team, right? So all of that plays into how I think about the role.
Not a methodology I heard of, but one I'd like to use. So when it comes into the world of alignment, which can be a massive rock depending on where the business is, where is that? Is that 80 or is that 20? How do we go about this in a deliberate way?
I think the alignment for me, it's probably in somewhere in between. It's probably the most important thing as you're coming in. I've been at this role 10 weeks now. And so coming in and getting alignment across the different functions and RevOps has the ability to cross over boundaries and bring different silos together. And so, I spent a lot of time in my first 4 weeks here talking to the CFO, talking to the service delivery leader, the sales leaders, getting an understanding of what the pain points across the organization were. So I think, those are all, important as you come into these kinds of roles, is to understand the landscape, but you have to do that quickly. So that is go talk to them, make some quick decisions around what is their pain point. Take notes of that, good notes that you can come back to in 4 weeks, and then start thinking about what the bigger play is.
Okay, great. And let's follow that bigger play theme, because one of the things you'd mentioned in the previous call was this idea of creating a unified vision. And I'm interested to hear how you go about that. Once you've understood the pains, how does the vision come into it?
Yeah, I think, as you're looking through that, for me, it always starts with the data set, right? So what data do you have at your hands to make those decisions? Understanding your product, right? So it took me a while to really dig in, understand what we were selling, who we were selling it to, listening intently to the leadership team around what their vision as a board and as a executive leadership ELT team, what their vision was. And I think the RevOps role and my role is to be somewhat of a chameleon. You can't really get stuck in your own little world of this is how I would do it all the time. You really have to be thinking about the larger organization, where they are in their life cycle, and you have to adjust your thought process, your methods of interaction and data gathering and all of that to where you are at this point in time.
Yeah, okay, I'm glad you mentioned data gathering, right? Because we imagine quite a mature organization we can understand how we can measure data throughout the customer journey because it is already aligned. But if a business wasn't yet aligned, I'm interested to hear more about that gathering piece, because data will be saying different things, we'll be measuring different things, it'll be in data at different places.
Yeah, I think from a data gathering perspective, data gathering, or the master data of what you have, it's always easy to get a bunch of data, right? So you can look at the CFO. Our CFO has tons of data. Our operational team, our delivery team, our account team, all of them have data that gets rolled up. And I'm in a unique position in my role to see that data across all those silos. So that whole concept of how much data can you get, there's no limit to the amount of data, right? So the critical part for me is then how do you turn that around? Where do you find consistency across the silos in the kind of data they want to look at and impact the company? And I always look at my data, whatever question I'm asking, what are the 3 to 5 actions that I can get out of that data set? So it may be hundreds and thousands of deals, or data related to service delivery at an account. There could be it's millions of lines of code, right? But how do I boil that down for the leadership team into 3 to 5 actions? So that's the pivot that I always try to make as I'm gathering that information, is how do I turn that around, feed it back to them? Now you mentioned, data. If you're a good data analyst, you can make the data say just about anything you want it to say. And so I try to remain true to what the data is saying, the facts of the data, and not get too involved in what the leadership team wants to say. So I always take a step back from what they want to say. I do my model separate from that conversation, and I let the model speak for itself. And then if that aligns to what the leadership team is wanting to say, that's great. If it doesn't align, then we have actions that we can take to actually get alignment so that the data says what they want in a couple months, right? In a year, right? So that's how I kind of interpret that data and the massive amount of data that's out there.
That's a good answer. And you began to answer the thing I was thinking about. When we're looking for these actions to make data simple, apologies for the dichotomy here. Like, do we approach it with, well, we want to do X, Y, and Z. Is that supported by the data? Or do we look at the data, like you said, from a step back and we go, well, actually, these are the actions the data is telling us to do? And if it is the latter, you mentioned speed earlier. I can imagine it takes a long time to start understanding that because you're having to go through a lot of stuff.
Right. Well, I think the first thing is to set the hypothesis, right? Mm-hmm. So, the leadership team sets the hypothesis of what they want to accomplish. And then you go run your model to determine if the data will support that hypothesis. And so that's part of it. So I don't think there's a single answer to the question. If it fits, then you can quickly take action, right? That puts you in that 80% rule that says, hey, the data supports what we're saying. We're just going to take really quick decisions and we're going to go execute. If the data comes back and doesn't say what you want it to say, then you're in the 20%. You got to slow down. You got to take a step back. Think about, what does the data say? Is the data you gathered the right data, right? So maybe there's a reason that it's skewed in one way or another. Are there one-timers that you could take out to massage it a little bit, clean it up a little bit? But if it still doesn't say what you want it to say, then you really have to take another step back and digest what it says. Give yourself a little bit of time to understand that, and then you can figure out what those next steps are.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. That's really cool. So on this, we're really thinking, something I speak to people so often about on the blog is ops. Are we trying to be a business partner? Because sometimes, like you said, you have to be somewhat of a contrarian. You have to provide validation or proof, and sometimes that can be challenging. Now, we were speaking earlier about getting to the front of the discussion, like being there when that process is being designed or strategy is being designed. How do we do that as a contrarian when we have to disagree with things sometimes? How do we make it so that we are invited to the beginning and not left out because we might disagree with the actions people already want to take?
Well, I think there's a couple things, right? You've got to have a relationship with your leadership team that's open, two-way conversation. A lot of folks who initially come into a revenue operations role are put there to drive process, not to think. Mm-hmm. And so, my last company, I was more in the process conversation. I wasn't invited to the strategy conversation. And I think that's a place that companies miss out on what a revenue operations person can bring to the table. Because in my current company, I'm part of that strategy conversation. I'm invited to the board meetings. I'm invited to those conversations. And the result of that is that I can align the processes to meet the objective, right? If you're in the room, if you're part of that early conversation, you can see where they're headed. You can start to get out in front of them from an operational perspective to support their decision making and make that a cleaner transition from the data to the decision and make it move faster. So, sometimes it's not in your control if you're part of that conversation or not. Sometimes that's just the culture of the company that you're with. But I think companies that are successful, reach out and look at all different, people in terms of who's in the company, what level they are, doesn't necessarily matter all the time. Successful companies look across the spectrum and see who's contributing, and they bring those people into the fold, and then they can move faster.
Brilliantly articulated. So, okay, we're in the room and we're helping to set the strategy. At some point, this needs to hand over to execution. Particularly in RevOps, obviously we talk about the silos there. So how do you handle the key transition or handover from strategy setting to execution and making sure that's in line with the vision we wanted?
Yeah, it's a good question. That's the biggest pain point, right? So especially for me and how I operate, I'm one of those people that I'm very quick to understand the strategy, to build the data set that supports the strategy, or get to a point where everything is aligned for that to happen. I'm very quick to get there. What I do is I surround myself with other detailed people who can do that last step. So for me, it's not everyone can be a strategy person and a detail-oriented process person. So I'm able to build the process around the strategy, get it 90%, right? And then I look for people in the organization that I've aligned with, that I've made, friendships with, relationship, kind of things. And I say, okay, here's where we are. I've got that buy-in we talked about earlier. And once you get the buy-in, then you reach across the different organizations and say, okay, who within the sales team, the CFO team, the delivery team, who needs to be part of this process and conversation to actually drive this the next layer into production? Because as a RevOps person, you can set the things, you can say all this, but in the end, you've got to get out into those teams if you're going to actually operationalize the process that you're going for.
Superb. So it's really, we need to be bringing people into the conversation all of the time, from strategy setting with ops, and then even to the executors between ops.
Yeah, and I think it's rolling that out. I mean, as a strategy for change management, right? What I like to do is I have that big conversation that says, where are we headed? What do we want to do? In our particular case, we've been working through a governance process. Stages, what stages do we want to employ, those types of things, what checkpoints to get out of stages and progress a deal forward. And I started that conversation about 3 weeks back at a very high level, strategic kind of level, setting the seeds of where I was wanting to go. And then I built onto that. I went and did a little bit of research. I came back, a week later with a a high level presentation that was a little more detailed, a little bit more meat to it. Got the buy-in, got everybody on the page. It was still open-ended enough that people felt like they were still making the decision. They were part of the conversation, but close-ended enough that it was going the direction I wanted it to go. And then, this week, I actually rolled out the first deck of, here's what the process looks like. Here's the diagrams. Here's the points, the questions to ask. Here's the checklist to go through. Here's all the stuff, the nuts and bolts of it at a very detailed level, and said, okay, here's what we've been talking about in a formed document. And I sent that out for review, got a few, things back on it to change and tweak a little bit, but no major changes because we've been talking about it for 3 weeks, right? And so I've got the leadership on board now. In 2 weeks, we have our sales kickoff here in Dallas. I'm going to roll that out to the rest of the sales team. And I've taken the opportunity along the way to share it here and there in a meeting with the sales team, with the sales reps, with the solution architects, our business operations people. So they've been seeing snippets of it along the way. So there's a bit of an anticipation that it's coming, and they can't help but like it when it shows up, right? So we'll see how that works out over the next few weeks. But that's the kind of the process of buy-in that I follow that has been successful for me.
Yeah, awesome. It's a nuanced art at this high level, it sounds like. Yeah, for sure. Final question for you then. If you're in a room of RevOps heroes, like all-stars, what would you ask them?
Oh, what would I ask RevOps all-stars? At this point, it's like I would be asking, what is their view on sales enablement, on training? How broad do you go, right? So we have a very unique role in that if you have the right leadership team, you can speak all the languages, right? And what I found as I was coming into when I came into this role of RevOps 5 years back, there weren't a lot of people who had the cross-discipline, functional understanding that I had, being in that CFO, that COO, that progression of career. Most of the RevOps people at that point were true, lifelong sales ops people who were thrusted into that role. What I've found over the last 5 years is that, increasingly companies are looking for the type of person that I am, that's cross-functional, speaks all those different languages, is able to bring all the groups together into a conversation. So my question would be, where do I stop, right? How big does my role get before I implode upon myself because I've taken too much on, right? So how big is the role? That'd be the question. Because right now it feels like I could expand into all kinds of different things. I'm really trying to set some boundaries of where I'm going to go and where I'm not, so that I can be successful.